I was sound asleep when the aggressive pounding started on my apartment door. The digital clock glowed 2:17 in the morning as I stumbled through the darkness, my heart racing from the sudden awakening. Through the peephole, I saw my cousin Derek standing there with this smug grin plastered across his face, gesturing wildly towards something behind him. When I opened the door, there was a massive moving truck parked outside with three burly guys waiting by the back. Derek looked me straight in the eye and said, "Grandpa's giving me your apartment. Start packing." He waved some official-looking paperwork in my face, while I stood there in my pajamas, completely bewildered by what was happening to my comfortable life. I stared at Derek in complete disbelief, my mind struggling to process what he had just said. "What are you talking about?" I asked, stepping out into the hallway in my bare feet. The cold concrete sent shivers up my spine as I noticed the three movers leaning against their truck smoking cigarettes and checking their phones like this was just another routine job for them. Derek reached into a leather portfolio and pulled out a thick folder filled with documents. "Harold signed everything over to me yesterday. He said using our grandfather's first name like they were best buddies or something. He finally realized you've been freeloading in this place for 5 years, while I've been working my tail off, trying to make something of myself." The papers looked incredibly official to my untrained eyes. There were notary seals, official stamps, and what appeared to be my grandfather's signature on multiple pages. A property transfer deed showed my apartment address with Derek's name listed as the new owner. Everything seemed legitimate, down to the fancy letterhead from some law firm I had never heard of. "This is insane," I said, flipping through the documents. "Grandpa would never do this without talking to me first. We speak every Sunday morning. He's never mentioned anything about wanting me to move out." Derek shrugged and pulled out his phone, showing me a text message thread. "He's been complaining about you for months, Jace. Says you take advantage of his generosity and never offer to pay rent or help with maintenance costs." The old man finally decided enough was enough. I tried calling Harold immediately, but the phone went straight to voicemail after one ring. That was strange because my grandfather always kept his phone charged and rarely missed calls, especially from family members. "Where is he?" I demanded. "I want to talk to him right now." "He's sleeping," Derek replied with that same irritating smirk. "Doctor's orders. He's been having some health issues lately, and I've been staying with him to make sure he takes his medications properly and doesn't overexert himself." Something felt wrong about this entire situation, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what was bothering me. Derek had always been the family screw-up, bouncing between jobs and getting into trouble with money. 6 months ago, he had been crashing on friends' couches and asking relatives for loans to cover basic expenses. Now, he was wearing expensive designer clothes, a gold watch that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and leather shoes that looked like they came from some high-end department store. How had someone who couldn't afford rent suddenly accumulated enough money for legal fees, moving services, and a complete wardrobe makeover? "You've got 48 hours to pack your stuff and get out." Derek continued folding the documents back into his portfolio. "The movers will be back Thursday morning at 8 sharp to help you load everything into their truck. They'll even drive you to wherever you want to go as long as it's within 50 miles of here." And if I refuse to leave, Derek's expression hardened. "Then we'll have the sheriff come out and evict you legally. These documents give me every right to take possession of this property, and law enforcement will back me up 100%. The three movers finished their cigarettes and started walking toward us. The tallest one, a guy built like a professional wrestler, spoke up. "We're done here for tonight, boss. What time Thursday morning?" 8 o'clock sharp, Derek confirmed. "Make sure you bring plenty of boxes and packing materials. From the looks of things, he's got a lot of junk to haul out of there." As the movers climbed back into their truck and drove away, I stood there feeling completely helpless. Derek handed me a business card for the moving company and headed toward a brand new black sedan that I had never seen before. "Wait," I called after him. "What about Harold's house phone? I tried calling earlier this week, and it said the number was disconnected." Derek paused with his hand on the car door handle. We had to cancel the landline. Too many scam callers were bothering him at all hours, and it was affecting his sleep quality. Everything goes through his cell phone now, but like I said, he needs his rest. He drove off into the night, leaving me standing in my hallway with a head full of questions and a growing sense of dread about what was really happening to my grandfather. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove straight to Harold's house in my 10-year-old Honda Civic. The familiar two-story colonial where I had spent countless childhood summers looked the same from the outside, but something felt different as I walked up the front steps. Uncle Robert answered the door instead of Harold, which immediately struck me as odd. Robert lived 40 minutes away and rarely visited unless there was a family gathering or holiday celebration. He was dressed casually in jeans and a polo shirt, looking like he had been there for a while, rather than just stopping by for a quick visit. Jace, he said, not opening the screen door. What brings you by so early? I need to speak with Harold about the apartment situation. Derek came by last night with some paperwork that doesn't make sense to me. Robert's expression shifted slightly, and he glanced back into the house before responding. Harold's resting right now. The doctor said he needs to avoid stress and excitement, so we're limiting his visitors to immediate family members only. I am immediate family, I pointed out. He's my grandfather too. Of course, but Derek mentioned you were pretty upset last night. We don't want Harold getting worked up over family drama when he's trying to recover from his recent health scare. This was the first I had heard about any health scare. Harold had seemed perfectly fine during our phone conversation the previous Sunday. He had been telling me about his neighbor's new vegetable garden and asking about my job at the insurance company. What health scare? I asked. He didn't mention anything to me. Robert seemed to consider his words carefully. Some chest pains last week. Nothing serious, but the doctor wants him taking it easy for a while. Derek's been staying here to help with medications and making sure he eats properly. Through the screen door, I could see into the living room, where Harold usually sat in his favorite recliner to watch the morning news. The chair was empty, and I noticed several unfamiliar items scattered around the coffee table. There were pill bottles, legal documents, and what looked like financial statements spread across the surface. Can I just say hello quickly? I pressed. I drove all the way over here and I'm worried about him. Robert hesitated again, then opened the screen door just enough for me to step inside. The house smelled different somehow, like cleaning chemicals mixed with something medicinal. Harold's usual routine involved brewing a pot of coffee first thing in the morning, but there was no coffee smell today. As we walked through the living room, I noticed that Harold's mail was stacked neatly on the side table instead of scattered around his chair like usual. My grandfather was notorious for opening his mail immediately and leaving it wherever he happened to be sitting. Where's Maria? I asked, referring to the housekeeper, who had been coming twice a week for the past 3 years. Her car wasn't in the driveway, and the house had an unusually sterile feeling that suggested professional cleaning rather than Maria's personal touch. We had to let Maria go, Robert explained. Harold decided he didn't need that kind of help anymore, and the expense was getting difficult to justify on his fixed income. This made absolutely no sense. Harold adored Maria and frequently told me how much her visits meant to him. She wasn't just a housekeeper. She was someone he looked forward to talking with about her grandchildren and her garden. Plus, Harold's finances were solid. His pension, Social Security, and investment income provided more than enough for comfortable living. We climbed the stairs to Harold's bedroom, where I found him lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. He looked smaller, somehow more fragile than I remembered from just a week ago. His usually neat gray hair was disheveled, and his eyes seemed unfocused. "Hey, Harold," I said softly, sitting in the chair beside his bed. "How are you feeling?" He turned his head toward me slowly, and for a moment his expression was blank. Then, recognition flickered across his face. "Jace, what are you doing here, son?" "I wanted to check on you and ask about the apartment. Derek showed me some paperwork last night that said you're giving him my place." Harold's brow furrowed in confusion. "Apartment? Which apartment?" The one I've been living in for 5 years. The one you helped me get when I started working at the insurance company. Oh, that apartment, Harold said, but he still looked puzzled. Derek's been helping me with a lot of paperwork lately. There are so many documents to sign for Medicare and insurance and all sorts of things. Sometimes I can't keep track of what's what. Robert stepped closer to the bed. Harold, the doctor, said you shouldn't be discussing business matters when you're not feeling well. It might confuse you more than help. I feel fine right now, Harold protested, trying to sit up straighter. Jace, did something happen with your apartment? Before I could answer, Robert interrupted. Dad, you're having one of your good moments, but we need to be careful not to overdo it. The medication makes your memory spotty sometimes. I had never heard anyone refer to Harold having memory problems before. During our weekly phone calls, he was always sharp and engaged, asking detailed questions about my work and remembering things from previous conversations. When did you sign the papers about my apartment? I asked Harold directly. He looked confused again. I'm not sure. Derek brings me things to sign almost every day now. He explains what they're for, but sometimes the words get jumbled in my head. My heart sank as I realized something was terribly wrong with this entire situation. Harold would never willingly give away my apartment without discussing it with me first. We had always had an understanding that the place was mine, as long as I needed it. Robert placed his hand on Harold's shoulder. Why don't you rest a little more, Dad Jace? Maybe we should let him sleep. As we prepared to leave the bedroom, I noticed Harold's glasses weren't on his nightstand, where he always kept them. Where are his glasses? I asked. Derek took them to get the prescription updated, Robert replied. The eye doctor said his vision had changed significantly. Harold had just gotten new glasses 2 months ago, and his vision had been fine. Nothing about this situation made sense, and I was starting to feel like Uncle Robert was deliberately keeping me away from having a real conversation with my grandfather. When we reached the living room, I noticed something else unusual. Harold's address book, which he normally kept by the telephone, was nowhere to be seen. That little black book contained decades' worth of contacts. Old friends, doctors, neighbors, and distant relatives. Where's his phone book? I asked. Robert looked around as if he hadn't noticed it was missing. I'm not sure. Maybe Derek put it somewhere safe. You know how forgetful Harold's been getting lately. But Harold wasn't forgetful, at least not until this week. Something was happening here that went beyond a simple property transfer, and I needed to figure out what Uncle Robert and Derek were really up to. As I was preparing to leave, I excused myself to use the bathroom and took the opportunity to quickly search Harold's desk in the den. Most of his personal papers had been removed, but I found his old address book tucked behind some unused file folders in the bottom drawer. I slipped it into my jacket pocket, knowing that the people in that book might be the key to understanding what was really happening to my grandfather. I drove straight from Harold's house to the offices of Patterson and Associates, a law firm that had been recommended by my neighbor who worked in real estate. Sarah Patterson was a sharp woman in her early 40s who specialized in property law and elder abuse cases. She examined Derek's documents for nearly an hour, using a magnifying glass to study the signatures and seals. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. I hate to tell you this, but these documents appear to be legally binding, she said, sliding the papers back across her desk. The notary signatures check out with state records. The paperwork follows proper legal procedures, and the signature matches your grandfather's handwriting samples from his driver's license and other official documents. My stomach dropped. So Derek can actually throw me out of my own apartment. Technically, it was never your apartment. According to these records, your grandfather owned it and has now transferred ownership to your cousin. If Harold was mentally competent at the time of signing, then yes, Derek has legal grounds to evict you. Sarah leaned back in her chair and studied my face carefully. However, there are some questions we could explore regarding your grandfather's mental competency at the time these documents were executed. How has Harold seemed to you lately? I told her about my visit that morning, describing Harold's confusion and Uncle Robert's strange behavior. Sarah took detailed notes, asking specific questions about Harold's usual mental acuity and any changes I had noticed in his personality or memory. "There's something else that bothers me," I added. "Derek was broke 6 months ago, but now he's wearing expensive clothes and driving a new car. Where did he suddenly get money for legal fees and moving services?" Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Financial exploitation often goes hand in hand with these types of property transfers. If we can prove your grandfather wasn't competent to make major financial decisions, we might be able to challenge the validity of these documents. She gave me homework: contact Harold's longtime physician, gather information about his recent medical history, and try to identify anyone who might have witnessed changes in his mental capacity over the past few months. I started with Dr. Elizabeth Grant, whose number I found in Harold's address book. When I called her office, the receptionist told me something that made my blood run cold. "I'm sorry, but Dr. Grant is no longer Mr. Harold's physician. He terminated his relationship with our practice about 2 months ago." "Terminated? Why would he do that? He's been seeing Dr. Grant for 15 years. "I can't discuss specific patient information, but I can tell you that Dr. Grant was very concerned about the circumstances surrounding his departure. She tried to contact him several times to ensure continuity of care, but his family said he no longer needed her services." I managed to reach Dr. Grant directly at her home that evening. She was hesitant to discuss Harold's case initially, but when I explained what was happening with the apartment, she became much more forthcoming. "I had been documenting early signs of dementia in Harold for about 6 months," she said quietly. "Nothing severe, but enough that I recommended he avoid making major financial decisions without consultation from family members he trusted." "Did you ever speak with Uncle Robert about this?" Dr. Grant paused. "Robert came to several appointments with Harold and seemed very interested in my findings. He kept pushing me to declare Harold completely incompetent, which I refused to do. Harold was still functioning well in most areas of his life, just experiencing some confusion with complex tasks." "What happened right before Harold stopped seeing you?" "Robert brought Harold in for what he said was a routine follow-up, but he had already scheduled appointments with 2 other physicians. He wanted me to sign papers stating that Harold was mentally incapacitated, and when I declined, he became quite angry. My worst fears were being confirmed. Do you think Harold was competent enough to sign property transfer documents 2 months ago?" Dr. Grant was quiet for a long moment. "Based on my observations and the progression of his symptoms, I would have serious concerns about his capacity to understand the full implications of such complex legal documents, especially if he was experiencing stress, or if someone was pressuring him." She also mentioned something that made my skin crawl. Robert had been asking very specific questions about Harold's medications and how they might affect his mental clarity. He seemed particularly interested in whether there were drugs that could temporarily improve cognitive function. After hanging up with Dr. Grant, I felt sick to my stomach. It was starting to look like Uncle Robert had been systematically manipulating Harold's medical care to create opportunities for financial exploitation. I spent the next day trying to track down Harold's current medical records. Robert had moved him to a new physician, Dr. Marcus Webb, whose office was nearly an hour away from Harold's house. When I called Dr. Webb's office, they confirmed that Harold was a recent patient, but said they couldn't discuss his case without written authorization. Through some persistence and a bit of luck, I managed to reach a nurse at Dr. Webb's office, who had concerns about Harold's case. She couldn't give me specific information, but she mentioned that Harold had been brought in 3 times in the past month and had seemed unusually compliant during examinations. "Most elderly patients ask questions or want to understand their treatment options," she said. This gentleman just nodded and agreed with everything, which struck me as odd for someone who was reportedly making important decisions about his property and finances. She also noted that Harold had been accompanied by his son every time, and that the son did most of the talking during appointments. The patient seemed confused about why he was there and kept asking when he could go home. That evening, I got a call from Derek. "Have you started packing yet?" he asked without any greeting. I'm exploring my legal options, I replied. Derek laughed. Good luck with that. I've got ironclad documentation, and Harold is being properly cared for by people who actually understand his medical needs. Any lawyer you hire is going to tell you the same thing my lawyer told me: the transfer is completely legal. Which lawyer are you using? I asked. Someone who specializes in elder law and estate planning. Very expensive, but worth every penny when you're dealing with complicated family situations. After Derek hung up, I realized something important. How had someone who couldn't afford basic living expenses suddenly hired a specialist lawyer and obtained multiple medical evaluations? The timeline didn't add up, and I was beginning to suspect that this scheme had been planned for much longer than anyone was admitting. I called Sarah Patterson again and arranged to meet with her first thing the next morning. We needed to move quickly if we were going to protect Harold from whatever was happening to him. I knew I needed to find Maria, Harold's former housekeeper, but I didn't have her contact information. The address book only contained her first name and a phone number that had been disconnected. I spent Tuesday morning driving around Harold's neighborhood, hoping to spot her distinctive blue Honda that she drove to her various cleaning jobs. Around 11 o'clock, I found her car parked outside a house 3 streets over from Harold's place. Maria was weeding flower beds in the front yard when I approached her. She was a petite woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Jace," she exclaimed, standing up and brushing dirt from her gardening gloves. "I was wondering when someone would come looking for the truth about what's happening to Harold." Maria's English was excellent, despite her slight accent, and she spoke with the authority of someone who had witnessed something deeply troubling. She invited me to sit on the front porch steps while she explained what she had observed during her final weeks working for Harold. "Robert started showing up at the house every day about 3 months ago," she began. "At first, Harold was happy to see his son visiting so regularly. But then, I noticed Robert bringing pill containers that I had never seen before." She pulled a small notebook from her purse and flipped through several pages of handwritten observations. I started writing things down because Harold was acting so strange. Some days he would be sharp and alert, asking me about my grandchildren and remembering details about my life. Other days he seemed confused and couldn't remember my name. "Did you notice any pattern to the confusion?" Maria nodded emphatically. "Always in the evenings, and always after Robert had given him his afternoon medications. Harold would take what Robert called his special vitamins around 2 o'clock, and by 4 or 5 in the afternoon, he would be asking the same questions over and over again." She showed me her notebook, which contained detailed daily entries about Harold's behavior, eating habits, and interactions with visitors. The pattern was unmistakable. Good days always occurred when Robert wasn't around, and confusion followed the administration of unknown medications. I tried to ask Harold about the new pills, but he said Robert told him they were prescribed by his new doctor for his heart condition. When I offered to help him organize his medications like I always did, Robert said that wasn't necessary anymore. Maria's voice grew angry as she continued. "Harold started asking me strange questions about you, Jace. He would say things like, 'Maria, do you think Jace is taking advantage of me? Robert says young people today don't appreciate what their elders do for them.' That doesn't sound like something Harold would say on his own." "Exactly. Harold always spoke so proudly of you. He used to show me pictures from your college graduation and tell me how responsible you were with money. But after Robert started visiting daily, Harold began repeating these negative comments about you that sounded like they were coming from someone else." Maria reached into her purse and pulled out her cell phone. "I have something else you need to see, but you must promise me you won't tell anyone where you got this." She showed me a video she had secretly recorded during her last week working for Harold. The footage showed Derek coaching Harold on what to say about wanting to give him the apartment. "Your grandfather loves you very much, but he thinks it would be better for the apartment to go to someone who will take care of it properly," Derek could be heard saying on the video. "Just nod when the lawyer asks if you want me to have it okay." In the video, Harold looked confused and kept asking questions. Which apartment? Why can't Jace take care of it? Who are you again? Derek patiently repeated the coaching several times, while Harold struggled to understand what was being asked of him. The most disturbing part came when Harold asked, "Is Jace in some kind of trouble? Did he do something wrong?" "Don't worry about that," Derek replied in the video. "Just remember what we practiced. You want me to have the apartment because I'm family, and I'll take good care of it." Maria also showed me photos she had taken of the medications Robert was giving Harold. There were several prescription bottles with labels that had been partially removed or covered with tape, making it impossible to read the drug names or dosages clearly. I researched some of the pill shapes and colors online, she said, flipping to another page in her notebook. Some of them looked like drugs used to treat anxiety or insomnia. Harold was taking something that made him drowsy in the afternoons, but also seemed to make him more suggestible. "Did you ever see the actual signing of the property transfer documents?" Maria's expression grew even more serious. "The notary came to the house on a Thursday afternoon. I was cleaning upstairs, but I could hear everything through the ventilation system. Harold asked multiple times who Derek was and why he was giving away your apartment. The notary seemed uncomfortable and asked if Harold understood what he was signing." "What did Derek say?" Derek told the notary that Harold was just having a senior moment, but that he had been talking about this decision for months. Then, I heard Robert's voice explaining that Harold's doctor had cleared him for making financial decisions, and that the family supported his choice. According to Maria, the actual signing took place during one of Harold's most confused periods. He had taken his afternoon medication about an hour before the notary arrived, and Maria could hear him stumbling over words and asking the same questions repeatedly. "The worst part," she said, "was hearing Harold ask, 'Will someone make sure Jace knows I still love him? I don't want him to think I'm angry with him.'" By the time Maria finished sharing her observations, I felt both heartbroken and furious. My grandfather had been systematically drugged and manipulated into signing away my home, while believing he was somehow protecting me from trouble. "Why were you fired?" I asked. "Robert said they couldn't afford my services anymore, but I know that's not true. He fired me the day after I asked too many questions about Harold's new medications. I think he was worried I would figure out what they were really doing." Maria handed me copies of all her notes and photos. I kept hoping someone from Harold's family would notice something was wrong and ask questions. "I'm so glad you came looking for the truth." Armed with this evidence, I now had documentation of the deliberate drugging and manipulation that had led to Harold signing documents he didn't understand. But I knew I would need even more proof to convince a court that the property transfer should be invalidated. With Maria's evidence in hand, I returned to Sarah Patterson's office Wednesday morning, feeling cautiously optimistic. Sarah reviewed the photos, videos, and Maria's detailed notes with the intensity of a prosecutor building a case. "This is exactly what we need to challenge Harold's competency," she said, making copies of everything. "But I want to dig deeper into the financial aspects of this situation. Property transfers like this often involve other irregularities." Sarah contacted her investigator, a former police detective named Mark Stevens, who specialized in financial crimes involving elderly victims. Within 24 hours, Mark had uncovered information that expanded the scope of Robert's scheme far beyond just my apartment. "Your uncle has been busy," Mark reported during a conference call Thursday afternoon. "In the past 4 months, Harold's name has appeared on property transfers for 3 different pieces of real estate, including a vacation cabin in the mountains and a rental house downtown." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Harold owns other properties." "Owned," Sarah corrected. "According to these records, he signed everything over to Robert and Derek between February and March of this year." Mark continued his findings. "The vacation cabin was transferred to Robert directly, supposedly, as payment for caregiving services. The rental house went to Derek, allegedly, as an early inheritance gift. Combined with your apartment, we're looking at property values totaling nearly $600,000. How did I not know about these other properties? Sarah leaned forward across her desk. When did you last discuss finances with Harold in detail? I thought back over our recent conversations. We don't really talk about money matters. He always seemed comfortable, and I never wanted to pry into his personal business. That's exactly what Robert was counting on, Mark said. He isolated Harold from family members who might ask questions and systematically gained control of his assets. Mark had also contacted Tom Bradley, Harold's longtime financial advisor, who had been mysteriously cut off from managing Harold's accounts 3 months earlier. Tom agreed to meet with us Friday morning, despite the potential legal complications. Tom Bradley worked from a modest office in a strip mall, but his reputation for honest financial management had earned him a loyal client base over 30 years in business. Harold had been working with Tom since the early 2000s, and Tom knew more about my grandfather's finances than probably anyone else in the world. Robert contacted me in January saying Harold wanted to make some changes to his investment strategy. Tom began. At first, it seemed reasonable. Harold was getting older and wanted to simplify his portfolio. But something felt wrong, Sarah asked. Tom nodded grimly. Harold had always been very conservative with money, but Robert was pushing for high-risk investments and large cash withdrawals. When I tried to discuss these changes with Harold directly, Robert said his father was too stressed by financial details and preferred to let him handle everything. Tom showed us account statements that revealed a disturbing pattern of activity over the past 4 months. Someone has been systematically draining Harold's accounts. Large cash withdrawals, transfers to accounts I don't recognize, and payments to creditors I've never heard Harold mention. How much money are we talking about? I asked. Just over $200,000 has been moved out of Harold's account since February. The withdrawals always happened on days when Robert accompanied Harold to the bank. Sarah and I exchanged glances. This was far more serious than a simple property grab. Tom pulled out a folder containing documentation he had been secretly maintaining. I was so concerned about these transactions that I started keeping unofficial records. Some of the payments were going to gambling establishments and loan companies. Derek has a gambling problem, I said, remembering rumors I had heard at family gatherings over the years. The pattern suggests someone was covering significant debts. Tom agreed. Harold never gambled and never borrowed money against his assets. These transactions were completely out of character for him. Mark Stevens had been quietly taking notes throughout our conversation. Tom, did Robert ever mention anything about changing Harold's will? Tom's expression grew even more troubled. That was actually the last straw for me. Robert brought Harold in 6 weeks ago and wanted me to witness changes to his estate planning documents. Harold seemed confused about what he was signing and kept asking why Jace's name was being removed from various beneficiary designations. My heart sank. He was removing me from the will. I refused to witness the signature because Harold clearly didn't understand what he was signing. Robert became very angry and said they would find someone else to handle Harold's financial affairs. That was the last time I saw either of them. After our meeting with Tom, Sarah, Mark, and I sat in a coffee shop trying to piece together the full scope of Robert's scheme. The evidence suggested a months-long plan to systematically strip Harold of his assets while isolating him from anyone who might interfere. We need to move quickly, Sarah said. If Robert realizes we're investigating, he might accelerate his timeline or try to hide additional assets. Mark had one more piece of disturbing information to share. I've been looking into Robert's personal finances, and he's in serious trouble. He owes money to some very unpleasant people, including a loan shark with connections to organized crime. How much does he owe? Based on court records and credit reports, Robert is at least $300,000 in debt. Some of that is to legitimate creditors, but a significant portion involves high-interest loans from people who don't accept late payments gracefully. The picture was becoming clear. Robert had been stealing from Harold to cover his own debts, using Derek's gambling problems as additional motivation to participate in the scheme. They had been methodically transferring Harold's assets to themselves while keeping him too confused and isolated to understand what was happening. "What's our next move?" I asked Sarah. "We contact Adult Protective Services and local law enforcement immediately. This isn't just property fraud anymore. It's elder abuse, financial exploitation, and potentially fraud on a scale that involves federal crimes." As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, my phone rang. It was Derek, and his tone was different from our previous conversations. "Jace, we need to talk. Can you meet me somewhere private this afternoon?" "What do you want to discuss?" Derek was quiet for a moment. "I think I might be in over my head with this whole situation. There are some things about my father's plan that I didn't fully understand when I agreed to help him." I looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "Where do you want to meet?" "There's a park near Harold's house. I'll be by the pond in an hour." As I hung up, I wondered if Derek was having second thoughts about participating in his father's scheme, or if this was another manipulation designed to throw us off track. Either way, I was about to find out just how deep this conspiracy really went. I met Derek at Riverside Park, a quiet spot where Harold used to take me fishing when I was a kid. Derek was sitting on a bench, staring at the water, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, and his usually confident demeanor had been replaced by obvious anxiety. "I screwed up, Jace," he said without looking at me. I really screwed up bad this time." I sat down on the opposite end of the bench, keeping some distance between us. "What are you talking about?" Derek pulled out his phone and showed me a text message thread that made my blood run cold. The messages were from someone named Vincent, and they contained increasingly threatening demands for payment of gambling debts totaling over $80,000. "These people are not patient," Derek continued. "They've been calling my father too demanding their money. When Dad came up with this plan to get Harold's properties, it seemed like our only way out of a really dangerous situation." "So you decided to rob my grandfather?" Derek finally looked at me, and I could see genuine fear in his eyes. "We told ourselves it was just borrowing against our inheritance. Dad said Harold would never miss the money, and that we'd pay it all back once we got on our feet financially. By drugging him and tricking him into signing documents he didn't understand." Derek's face crumpled. "The drugs were Dad's idea. He researched medications that could make Harold more cooperative during important conversations. I thought we were just helping Harold feel less anxious about making financial decisions. I wanted to punch him, but I also recognized that Derek might be our best chance of getting justice for Harold." "Are you willing to testify against your father?" "I don't know if I have a choice anymore. Vincent's people came to my apartment yesterday and made it very clear that they expect their money by next week. Dad keeps telling me everything will work out, but I think he's planning something that could get Harold seriously hurt." Derek explained that Robert had been researching Harold's life insurance policies and had made comments about how much easier things would be if Harold's health took a sudden turn for the worse. The implication was chilling. "You have to help me stop this," Derek pleaded. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt. I just needed money to pay off these debts before Vincent decided to collect payment in other ways." I called Sarah Patterson from the park and explained Derek's willingness to cooperate. Within 2 hours, we had arranged a meeting with Detective Lisa Morrison from the County Sheriff's Department, who specialized in elder abuse and financial crimes. Detective Morrison was a no-nonsense woman in her late 30s, who had seen enough cases like this to recognize the urgency of our situation. She listened carefully as Derek recounted the details of his father's scheme, recording everything for potential use in criminal proceedings. "How long has this been going on?" she asked Derek. "Dad started planning this back in December when my gambling debts got out of control. He said family members needed to stick together and that Harold had more money than he could ever spend." Detective Morrison took detailed notes as Derek described the systematic isolation of Harold from his normal support network, the introduction of unauthorized medications, and the coaching sessions before legal documents were signed. "Do you have any of the medications your father was giving Harold?" Derek nodded and pulled a pill bottle from his jacket pocket. "I kept this because something felt wrong about the whole thing. Dad said it was just a mild sedative to help Harold sleep better, but Harold was taking it during the day too. Detective Morrison examined the bottle, which contained white pills with no identifying markings. We'll need to have these analyzed by a lab, but if they contain controlled substances that weren't prescribed for Harold, your father could face serious criminal charges. The next step was getting Harold examined by an independent medical professional who could assess his current mental state and determine whether he had been competent to sign legal documents during the past few months. Detective Morrison arranged for Dr. Michael Chen, a geriatric psychiatrist with extensive experience in dementia and elder abuse cases, to evaluate Harold the following day. Dr. Chen would assess Harold's cognitive function and provide an expert opinion about his capacity to make complex financial decisions. Meanwhile, Sarah Patterson was working with Tom Bradley to freeze Harold's remaining accounts and prevent any additional unauthorized transactions. She had also filed emergency motions to temporarily halt any further property transfers and to place Harold's assets under court protection. The good news is that we're moving fast enough to prevent additional damage, Sarah told me Thursday evening. The bad news is that recovering the money and property that have already been transferred will require extensive legal proceedings. Derek had agreed to cooperate fully with law enforcement in exchange for consideration in his own sentencing. Detective Morrison explained that Derek would likely face charges related to the fraud, but his cooperation and the extenuating circumstances of his gambling debts might result in a more lenient sentence. Friday morning, Dr. Chen met with Harold at his house while Robert was out running errands. Derek had convinced his father to leave for a few hours by claiming he needed help moving some items into storage. Dr. Chen's evaluation revealed what we had suspected but hoped wasn't true. Harold was suffering from moderate dementia that would have made him legally incompetent to understand the implications of signing major financial documents. Based on my assessment and the timeline you've provided, Harold has likely been experiencing significant cognitive decline for at least 6 months, Dr. Chen reported. The administration of unauthorized sedatives and anxiety medications would have exacerbated his confusion and made him much more susceptible to manipulation. Dr. Chen also found evidence that Harold had been deliberately kept in a state of mild dehydration and nutritional deficiency, both of which could worsen cognitive symptoms in elderly patients. This appears to be a systematic effort to maintain Harold in a compliant state while preventing him from thinking clearly about important decisions. Armed with Dr. Chen's evaluation, Derek's testimony, and the financial evidence compiled by Mark Stevens, Detective Morrison obtained arrest warrants for Robert on charges of elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and theft. The arrest took place Saturday morning when Robert returned to Harold's house, expecting to find Derek helping pack more of Harold's belongings for safekeeping. Instead, he found Detective Morrison and 2 uniformed officers waiting for him. "Robert Henderson, you're under arrest for elder abuse and financial exploitation," Detective Morrison announced as she placed handcuffs on a visibly shocked Robert. As Robert was being led away, he shouted threats at Derek about what would happen when Vincent's people couldn't get their money. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into," he yelled. "These people don't forgive debts, and they don't care about your cooperation with the police." Derek looked terrified, but Detective Morrison assured him that law enforcement was prepared to provide protection if the threats materialized into actual danger. With Robert in custody and Derek cooperating as a witness, we finally had the legal foundation necessary to begin reversing the damage that had been done to Harold's finances and property holdings. The legal system moved with surprising efficiency once the evidence of elder abuse and fraud was presented to the court. Judge Patricia Williams, who had presided over numerous elder abuse cases, took immediate action to protect Harold's remaining assets and begin the process of recovering stolen property. Within 2 weeks of Robert's arrest, all property transfers involving Harold's real estate were declared invalid due to his diminished mental capacity at the time of signing. My apartment was officially returned to Harold's ownership with the understanding that I would continue living there under our original arrangement. The vacation cabin and rental house were also returned to Harold's estate, although recovering them required additional legal proceedings to remove Derek and Robert from the premises. Derek voluntarily surrendered his claim to the properties as part of his cooperation agreement with prosecutors. Robert faced serious criminal charges, including elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and theft of over $200,000. His attorney initially tried to argue that Robert had been acting in Harold's best interests, but the evidence of systematic drugging and financial manipulation was overwhelming. During the sentencing hearing, Sarah Patterson presented a comprehensive timeline of Robert's actions, including the forced medication isolation from healthcare providers and coaching sessions before document signings. The judge sentenced Robert to 6 years in state prison and ordered him to pay full restitution for all stolen money plus damages. This court takes elder abuse very seriously, Judge Williams stated during sentencing. The defendant systematically exploited his own father's trust and medical vulnerability for personal financial gain. This represents one of the most callous forms of family betrayal this court has encountered. Derek received a much lighter sentence of 2 years probation and community service, along with mandatory participation in gambling addiction treatment programs. His cooperation had been essential in building the case against Robert, and the court recognized that Derek had been manipulated by his father's desperation as much as his own poor judgment. I want to apologize to Harold and to Jace for my part in this terrible situation, Derek said during his sentencing hearing. I let my gambling addiction cloud my judgment, and I allowed my father to convince me that stealing from family was somehow acceptable. I'm getting help for my gambling problem, and I'm committed to making amends however I can. Detective Morrison helped Derek relocate to a different city and enter a debt counseling program to address his gambling creditors through legal channels rather than continued criminal activity. Vincent and his associates were eventually arrested on unrelated charges, removing the immediate threat to Derek's safety. Harold's recovery proved more encouraging than anyone had initially expected. Once the unauthorized medications were eliminated from his system and he resumed proper medical care with Dr. Grant, his cognitive function improved significantly. The combination of dementia medications and sedatives was creating a fog that made Harold's natural condition much worse. Dr. Grant explained during one of Harold's follow-up appointments. With proper treatment and the removal of those harmful drugs, he's functioning much better than he was 6 months ago. Harold was able to understand what had happened to him and expressed deep remorse for the situation, even though everyone assured him that he had been the victim rather than the cause of the problems. Jace: I'm so sorry you had to go through this because of my family, Harold said during one of our first real conversations after his recovery began. I never wanted to give away your apartment. I was so confused during those months that I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. You don't have anything to apologize for, Harold. You were protecting me the only way you knew how, during a time when you were being deliberately manipulated. We arranged for Harold to receive professional in-home care to ensure his safety and well-being. Maria was eager to resume her position as Harold's companion and housekeeper, providing both practical assistance and the emotional support that had been missing during Robert's manipulation. Tom Bradley resumed managing Harold's finances and helped recover most of the stolen money through insurance claims and the liquidation of Robert's personal assets. The financial damage was significant, but not catastrophic, thanks to our early intervention. Dr. Grant worked with Harold to establish a comprehensive healthcare plan that included regular cognitive assessments and protection against future manipulation. We also created a family support system involving myself, Maria, Tom Bradley, and Dr. Grant to ensure Harold would never again be isolated from people who genuinely cared about his welfare. Through this painful experience, I learned the critical importance of staying actively involved in the lives of elderly family members and recognizing the warning signs of abuse and exploitation. Elder abuse often happens gradually and involves trusted family members who exploit their victims' love and dependency. Harold's case taught me that protecting vulnerable family members requires vigilance, regular communication, and the courage to ask difficult questions when something doesn't seem right. If I had been more attentive to changes in Harold's behavior and the suspicious circumstances surrounding his medical care, we might have prevented much of the damage that occurred. The most important thing I learned, I told Harold during one of our Sunday morning phone calls, is that family means protecting each other, especially when someone is too vulnerable to protect themselves. Harold's voice was stronger and clearer than it had been in months. You did protect me, Jace. When everyone else either didn't notice or didn't care enough to look closely, you fought for me. That means everything to an old man who was losing hope. 6 months after Robert's arrest, Harold was living independently again, with appropriate support services in place. His cognitive function had stabilized, and while he still dealt with the early stages of dementia, he was able to enjoy life and maintain meaningful relationships with family and friends. Derek completed his community service working with elderly residents at a local nursing home, an experience that helped him understand the real impact of elder abuse on its victims. He remained in counseling for gambling addiction and had successfully avoided any gambling activities for over a year. Working with elderly people every day has shown me how precious and fragile they are. Derek told me during one of our occasional phone conversations, I can't believe I ever thought it was okay to take advantage of Harold's trust. These people deserve our protection, not our exploitation. As for my apartment, Harold insisted that I continue living there, rent-free, but I started paying for utilities and maintenance as a way of contributing to household expenses. We also established a formal rental agreement that would protect both of us and provide clear documentation of our arrangement. The experience brought Harold and me closer together than we had ever been before. Our weekly phone calls became more frequent, and I started visiting him every couple of weeks to share meals and help with household projects. You know, Harold said one Sunday afternoon as we worked together in his garden, maybe this whole terrible situation happened for a reason. It showed both of us what family really means, and it brought us together in a way that might never have happened otherwise. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that protecting the people we love sometimes requires us to be brave enough to challenge family members and ask uncomfortable questions. Elder abuse thrives in silence and isolation, but it can be stopped when caring family members pay attention and take action. Harold lived to be 87 years old, and he spent his final years surrounded by people who genuinely loved and respected him. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 years later, he left behind a will that reflected his true wishes, rather than the manipulated documents that Robert had tried to force him to sign. The most valuable lesson I learned from this experience is that true family loyalty means protecting each other from harm, even when that harm comes from within the family itself. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to stay silent when someone you care about is being hurt or exploited. I hope that sharing Harold's story might help other families recognize the warning signs of elder abuse and find the courage to take action before irreversible damage occurs. Every elderly person deserves to live with dignity, safety, and the knowledge that their family will protect them when they can no longer fully protect themselves. Have you ever noticed changes in an elderly family member that made you wonder if someone might be taking advantage of them? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you or taught you something important about protecting elderly loved ones, please give it a like and consider subscribing for more stories about standing up for family when it matters most. Sharing this video could help other families recognize similar warning signs and take action to protect their vulnerable relatives. Thank you for listening to Harold's story, and I hope it inspires you to cherish and protect the elderly people in your own life. Remember that sometimes the most important thing we can do for family is to pay attention and ask questions when something doesn't feel right.